The room had not changed much in 30 years. The wallpaper still peeled in narrow curls, as if time itself had tried to step forward but caught on something sharp and stopped. Dust floated in the narrow beam of a single window, drifting through the air in slow, wandering spirals. The place felt suspended, motionless, as though the last moment of 1992 had never truly ended. And when Detective Caleb Mercer stepped across the threshold again, it felt like walking into a held breath. For the first 100 words, the scene needed to grip him, and it did. The faint smell of forgotten wood, the cold quiet, the echo of a memory he had tried not to revisit. The case had never left him. It lived in the corners of his mind, the same way the dust lived in the corners of the room, unshaken, unbothered, quietly settled. Her name had been Mariel Duvall, 24 years old, studying environmental science at a small college outside Baton Rouge. A person with a sharp mind and a quiet presence, someone classmates described as steady, committed, the type who remembered people's birthdays even when they forgot hers. She came from a small river town, raised by her grandmother after her parents relocated abroad for work. Her days followed patterns: classes, lab work, weekend volunteering. Nothing in her background aligned with harm, no sign she was part of anything dangerous or unpredictable. Yet her life had ended here on a humid September night, in this dim rental house she used for weekend study retreats. The report never settled neatly. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no clear intent. She was found lying near the far wall, as if she had simply collapsed and the world forgot to check on her. The cause was recorded in the file with rigid phrasing, words Caleb never liked seeing. But beyond that description, the deeper truth remained unknown. Why she was here alone, why she was targeted at all, who might have approached her. Caleb moved slowly across the old floorboards. They groaned under his shoes, each step stirring decades of stillness. He paused near the place where her body had rested, a faint discoloration still marking the wood. He crouched, not touching the surface, but studying it the way one studies something once familiar but painfully distant. He remembered the night he first responded, flashing lights cutting through the dark fields, the mist rising from the nearby river, the silence of the neighbors who looked out from behind curtains but came no closer. He had been younger then, his mind more sure, less weighed down. He thought every case was solvable if one just pushed hard enough. He thought wrong. The evidence had been thin from the start. A few fingerprints inside the house reportedly belonged to earlier tenants. A neighbor reported hearing a car door 1 hour before the estimated time of death, but could not describe make or model. One student had mentioned Mariel planned to meet someone about a project, but that lead dissolved immediately. Everything dissolved. Every direction turned into air. The case file became a fixture on Caleb's shelf, not closed but not advancing, a symbol of something that stayed just barely out of reach. Now, standing in the stillness again, he felt something like a shift. Not sudden, not dramatic, just quiet, the kind of quiet that suggests a door has at last unlocked. He inhaled the faint scent of dust and old paper. His breath moved through the space, stirring particles that had waited decades. They rose, glimmering briefly in the afternoon light, like small ghosts disturbed from a long sleep. He whispered barely a sound, "Mariel, I'm here again." The words disappeared instantly into the room. Nothing answered, nothing moved. But something in the atmosphere felt different. Something had changed. And that shift was what brought him back. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It began quietly, as cold cases often do when they choose their moment to return. A box had arrived at the precinct archives 2 weeks earlier, marked for routine inventory review. Inside were folders transferred from an old outbuilding scheduled for renovation. Most contained minor reports from the early 1990s, petty thefts, neighbor disputes, a few missing person files eventually resolved. The kind of paperwork that had long lost its urgency. But at the bottom of the box, beneath a stack of unrelated forms, lay a brown envelope that should not have existed. The label read, Duvall Supplemental. The handwriting did not match any of the original investigators. No record indicated its creation. No signature, date stamp, or chain of custody marker appeared anywhere on it. Caleb opened it with a restrained motion, expecting outdated statements or misplaced photos. Instead, he found a single item, a contact sheet of 12 film negatives, all showing angles of the original crime scene. He recognized most of them, the window, the desk, the area where Mariel had been found. But one frame stood out sharply, as if it had waited 3 decades for someone to finally look directly at it. It depicted the small study table Mariel used for her weekend work. On the surface lay her notebooks, arranged neatly. But beside them, partially hidden by a shadow, was a photo, a small square print that was never logged, never mentioned in any original reports. The contact sheet allowed just enough detail to see that the photo showed Mariel with someone outdoors in daylight. Their faces were turned slightly toward each other, mid-conversation. The companion's figure was blurred, too indistinct to identify, but their posture suggested familiarity, maybe even ease. Nothing about the person seemed threatening. But the fact the item appeared in an unlogged photo and then vanished from all evidence raised a single, cold question. Who had removed it? And why? Caleb held the contact sheet up to the light. The shadows shifted across the negatives. He had looked at these rooms countless times in his memory, but not once had he seen this angle. Not once had anyone mentioned it existed. He requested permission to reopen the file. The approval came quickly. The department viewed it as routine administrative error, nothing more. But Caleb sensed the presence of something deeper, not a conspiracy, not something dramatic or exaggerated, just a small misplacement with consequences heavy enough to tilt the case in a new direction. He returned to the old rental house the next morning. The location had remained unoccupied for years, owned by a family disinterested in renovation. Keys were retrieved from the property office, the same brass keys issued in the early 90s. Inside, the air felt close, as if the structure held its breath for 3 decades. He moved toward the study area, matching every detail with the old floor plan. The desk was still there, though warped slightly by moisture. A faint outline on the surface suggested where Mariel's notebooks might have rested. The window above it allowed muted light to spill over the space, the same way it had on the day she was found. Caleb studied the room slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim. He listened to the distant whir of insects outside, the settling of wood, the whisper of leaves brushing the siding. Each sound added to the sense of suspended time. He pictured the missing photo, Mariel standing outdoors speaking with someone, the tilt of her head, the ease of her posture. Whatever moment had been captured, it had mattered enough for her to keep the photo near her work, close at hand. If someone had removed it later, that act alone could speak louder than anything printed on the image itself. He whispered into the silence, not expecting a reply. "Who were you meeting, Mariel?" The room absorbed the words. The dust settled, but something felt closer now, something long concealed finally edging into reach. This was no coincidence. It began instead with a photo hidden in plain sight, a photo someone, 30 years ago, had quietly taken away. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Back at his desk, Caleb spread the entire case file before him, arranging the documents with the care one might give to fragile heirlooms. Reports yellowed by humidity. Transcripts typed on old ribbon machines. Evidence logs filled out in handwriting faded by time. He moved slowly, methodically, letting each page settle into place before reading. He began with the earliest report, the discovery call made by a passerby who noticed the door ajar during a morning walk. The man's account had been straightforward. Door open, unusual, thought someone was inside. No mention of vehicles, no mention of voices, nothing that contradicted the timeline. Caleb underlined the line about the door being slightly open. Could the killer have left it that way intentionally, or had it drifted open overnight? He read the medical examiner's report next. Words clinical, restrained. No anomalies noted beyond what was expected. Caleb traced the sentences with a distant stare, searching for anything he might have missed before. Nothing new surfaced. Then he turned to the witness interviews. A professor who described Mariel as focused, quiet, reliable. A classmate who last saw her leaving campus, carrying a folder of assignments. A neighbor from the rental road, who recalled seeing a light on around midnight. But one interview pulled his attention. A local shop owner who said Mariel occasionally stopped for supplies. The owner described her as polite, soft-spoken, always carrying a small notebook she wrote in constantly. At the end of the statement was a brief, overlooked comment. She came in with someone once. Early 92 maybe, tall, calm voice, didn't catch a name. Caleb leaned back slowly. That detail had been dismissed in the original investigation because it lacked specifics, but combined with the newly uncovered photo, it carried weight. A tall companion, calm voice, someone comfortable enough to accompany her into town, someone familiar. He sifted through the remaining notes, searching for any mention of visitors, acquaintances, or collaborative projects. A lab partner's name appeared repeatedly, someone who had since moved to another state. But the lab partner had been ruled out early for solid reasons, and no new evidence pointed toward him. He examined the floor plan again, tracing the steps Mariel might have taken in her final hours. Notebook on the desk, jacket on the hook, a cup on the counter, still half full when police arrived. Her movements seemed deliberate, methodical. Nothing suggested panic or surprise. He noticed something else in the photos, the window lock. In one frame, it appeared in a slightly different position than in another frame taken minutes later. A subtle shift, almost unnoticeable. Had someone reopened the window or closed it? He checked the dispatch logs. A breeze was recorded that night, strong enough to move loose branches. Perhaps the window rattled, or perhaps someone had used the window to enter or exit, but the sill showed no signs of disturbance in the initial report. Unless the disturbance had been small, precise, and overlooked. He returned to the contact sheet one more time. He held it up, let the afternoon light pass through it. The missing photo. The tall companion. The window lock shifted between frames. Each detail felt minor, almost trivial, yet they aligned with unsettling accuracy, like pieces of a small but quietly significant pattern. A pattern he should have seen 30 years ago. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of that realization settle in his chest, steady, heavy, but not discouraging. Guilt was familiar, but this time it felt constructive, pushing him forward rather than holding him still. When he opened his eyes again, his focus sharpened. Something had been hidden in the quiet margins of this case, not through deception, not through elaborate planning, but through modest, almost ordinary omissions. He whispered, barely audible, "I missed something simple." The paper on the desk shifted slightly under the motion of his hand. The faint crinkle of aging files filled the room, sounding almost like distant footsteps, the soft echo of a truth finally approaching. When Caleb cataloged the living map of people connected to Mariel, the list read like a modest constellation, close, peripheral, bright in different ways. Each point had its own gravity. There was Dr. Harold Voss, her thesis advisor, a man with a slow, deliberate voice and the kind of reputation that steadied grant committees. He had a tidy office at the university and a calendar full of meetings. He had the institutional power to shape careers. Motive, preserve professional status, silence threats to published work. Alibi, meeting at the faculty club that evening, multiple witnesses, one of whom was his administrative assistant. Demeanor, measured, polite, almost solicitous when speaking of Mariel. He had been dismissed early in the original inquiry as too public, too visible to be involved. There was Liam Cutter, a former partner in a student research co-op, sharp, restless, prone to resentments. He had argued with Mariel once over data interpretation. Motive, professional jealousy, fear of being accused of carelessness. Alibi said he was at a late-night lab session with another student. The lab's time logs showed activity, but the system could be manipulated if someone wanted to shift timestamps. Demeanor, terse, defensive, easily agitated. He had been questioned, and then largely disregarded because his friction with Mariel seemed typical for young collaborators. There was Mariel Duvall, Mariel's grandmother, the quiet center of the family. She lived in the same small town, tended a small garden, and kept to routine. Motive, protect family secrets, fear of scandal. She'd once asked Mariel to avoid stirring trouble. Alibi, home, asleep, neighbors heard nothing. Demeanor, steady in grief, unassuming. The investigators had seen her as bereft, not capable of calculated wrongdoing. There was Tommy Raines, the rental house's occasional handyman, a man known in the neighborhood whose presence was tolerated but never spotlighted. Motive, small resentments, access to keys and rooms. Alibi, claimed to have been doing an overnight job elsewhere. His truck was seen in a nearby parking lot, but no one tracked his steps closely. Demeanor, evasive but not notably violent. There was Marceline, the shop owner, who had once mentioned seeing Mariel with someone in town. Motive, none obvious beyond neighborly concern. Alibi, he ran the store and had customers. Demeanor, observant, talkative. He had been a minor witness before the file reopened. Caleb placed their photos across the desk like cards, then rewound the file's timeline in his head. Each person's story contained friction lines, jealousies, protectiveness, convenience, but also plausible innocence. He interviewed them again with a kind of surgical calm that had grown into him over decades. He watched micro-expressions, the way Harold's fingers brushed a paper's edge, the slight tremor in Liam's jaw when asked about data logs, Evelyn's repeated habit of folding a corner of her handkerchief, Tommy's avoidance of eye contact, Marceline's habit of looking to the door as if expecting someone to walk in. Each suspect had an alibi that might have held under casual scrutiny, but the reopened file's small additions, the contact sheet, the missing photo, the unlocked window, had changed the way those alibis sat next to one another. Where before a detail looked isolated, now it could be placed beside another and felt less accidental. Caleb kept his questions taut and minimal. "Where were you between 11 and 2?" he would ask, then let silence sit like a measuring instrument, giving weight to whatever answer followed. Responses came fragmented, natural. "At the faculty club. I was in the lab. I was asleep. Working on a job. Open all night." The brevity of replies left room for doubt. None of them on the surface fit the classic profile of a perpetrator. Each could be explained, rationalized. They each had plausible roots out of suspicion. And that, Calder thought, is where danger hides, in the plausible, in the person who is small enough to be overlooked or grand enough to be trusted. He mapped motives against opportunity. Harold's position gave him authority but also scrutiny. Liam's agitation suggested anger but didn't prove reach. Evelyn had proximity and intimacy. She also had the kind of trust that can conceal unusual acts. Tommy had tools and keys. Marceline had the photo memory. When suspects look like human beings rather than archetypes, the investigation turns quieter and more stubborn. Caleb's work became a patient sorting of ordinary facts, each measured and reweighed. He found himself returning again and again to small things: the seam of a coat, the pattern of a shoe tread, the familiar tilt of a voice when someone lies to themselves. The suspects circled the case not like wolves, but like people who had lost someone, and then, fittingly, became suspects because they had been close. The mensuration of motive and alibi felt less like a tribunal and more like measures taken by someone trying to decide which shadow cast a true shape. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. Slow is the pace of truth in cases like this. It arrives not in thunder, but as a steady accumulation of small distances closing. The key was, as often with old photographs, detail. The contact sheet's hidden frame had shown Mariel with someone. When Caleb obtained a higher resolution scan, a small element in the background caught his eye: a patch of soil at the hem of the companion's trousers. It matched the garden loam described by Evelyn's neighbors. That soil, when compared to samples from several suspects' known locations, bore a unique mineral fleck consistent with clay used in Evelyn's garden. A footprint by the window, blurred but present in a grainy photo from 1992, matched an older boot pattern not widely sold. Caleb tracked a small local repair shop that specialized in such soles. The shop's ledger, dusted off now for the reopened case, showed Tommy's name on a repair around that time. But Tommy's repairs had included different soles. The ledger entry, simple and bland, didn't match the print's size precisely. A receipt found tucked into Mariel's notebook, a bus ticket dated the week before her death, suggested she had traveled to a town where Dr. Voss had family property. It was a thin link but relevant when paired with a margin note in her handwriting: "Ask H about collection." The note hinted at a conversation related to data, something that might embarrass an academic if misrepresented. Meanwhile, the window lock's subtle shift between frames took on new meaning when Caleb revisited the house at dusk and tested the mechanism. It could be manipulated to appear undisturbed while allowing a narrow exit, a detail someone familiar with the house's nuances could exploit. Who, among those who knew Mariel and the rental, would understand such small mechanical traits? The missing photograph itself became a fulcrum. When Caleb examined the envelope that contained the contact sheet, he found an unremarkable thumbprint along its edge. Forensic re-examination, now possible with modern techniques, matched it with a print lifted from the old faculty club meeting card. The print belonged to Dr. Voss. Caleb sat in his office as rain traced streaks down the window. Dr. Voss's thumbprint on a supplemental envelope from the crime scene's materials felt like a chord struck out of place. The presence of his print did not, on its own, indict, but it prompted recalibration. Why would a man of Harold's standing touch evidence, even by accident? Did he handle case materials in his role? No records indicated interaction with crime files. The match was small but precise. The emotional currents beneath each person's behavior also surfaced. Liam's defensiveness, when paired with annotations in Mariel's lab notebook criticizing a method he favored, suggested more than professional disagreement. Evelyn's repeated insistence that Mariel not make waves, now read differently, less as elder caution, and more as someone trying to deflect into calmness the worry of being found out. Tommy's evasions became more than nervousness. They became the way of someone who had learned to avoid certain conversations. Marceline's memory of the daytime photo became crucial, because the man in the image was not an institutional figure, but someone who moved with the ease of a mentor and the familiarity of a regular customer. The evidence, modest individually, formed a web when considered together. Soil flakes connecting to Evelyn's garden, a boot pattern nearly matching Tommy's repairs, a thumbprint linking Dr. Voss to the envelope, a receipt and notebook margin tying Mariel to a conversation about collection with someone in Voss's orbit. Each thread by itself could be explained away. Together, they suggested pressure points. Caleb began to see not a violent outburst but a gradual compression. Mariel's discovery of irregularities in data, perhaps even a misuse of results, and her intent to confront or expose the issue. Those who stood to lose from exposure had different ways to manage risk: silence, discredit, concealment. And in the quiet center of those options sat an act that changed everything. He revisited interview transcripts, listening anew for emotional tremors rather than factual clarity. He worked the files like a patient surgeon feeling for a pulse. When he asked about the night again, voices dropped, hesitations lengthened, small truths slipped into sentences with the same unpolished honesty as rust on an old hinge. The clues had not arrived like revelations but like shifts in pressure. A fingerprint here, a footnote there, a soil sample that matched a backyard. Each made the landscape of suspicion tilt a degree. Each tied inconsistencies to human tensions: pride, fear, protectiveness, the dread of ruined reputations. On a quiet night, Caleb traced the path Mariel might have taken if she had been leaving to confront someone. Down the back steps, along the narrow lane to a parked car. The lane matched the tire marks found near the riverbank in an old investigator's photograph. The tire track pattern overlapped with vehicles associated with the university, a service van sometimes used by faculty for field work. That van, in turn, connected back not by coincidence but by scheduling logs to Dr. Voss. A web then, small, complicated, human. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. The twist unfolded the way a small crack runs through glass, not with a single shattering blow, but with a quiet propagation until the entire pane gives way. All along, the least suspected person in the constellation had been Mariel Duvall. The community had imagined an elder unthreatening, a woman grounded in daily routines of tea and gardening, someone whose principal battle was against time. The investigators sought the dramatic outlier: a jealous ex, a disgraced professor, an avaricious handyman. Evelyn's name sat in the file as a sorrowful footnote. The logic that turned suspicion toward her did not appear from theatrics. It arrived through methodical strings of proportional evidence and the particular human pattern of protection. Mariel had been on the edge of exposing an irregularity. A lab sample collection Dr. Voss had used to support a minor grant bid. The sample's provenance was thin. Mariel had written notes suggesting she intended to speak with a colleague about discrepancies before turning that concern into anything formal. The margin note, "Ask H about collection," became a keystone. The contact sheet photo showed Mariel and someone she trusted. The soil trace, originally linked to Evelyn's garden, suggested the companion had spent time at Evelyn's house recently. The boot print at the window suggested a person who had been in and out of the property and who knew the house's small mechanical quirks. Tommy's ledger and Dr. Voss's thumbprint complicated matters, but didn't account for the nuanced domestic details. A handkerchief with a familiar scent, a teacup washed in a distinctive way, a seam in a jacket that matched a pattern Evelyn preferred when she mended clothes. It was a tiny entry in a church donation ledger that finally fractured the calm surface. A name, Mariel Duvall, listed as picking up a parcel for Dr. Voss during the week Mariel died. The parcel was innocuous on its face, research supplies. But the ledger's note included timing that placed Evelyn in town at odd hours. When asked, she had said she ran errands for neighbors sometimes, a neighborly kindness that had been accepted without question. When confronted with the ledger entry, Evelyn's eyes did not flash anger or fear. They narrowed into a precise, steady grief that did not apologize. She admitted quietly to having been in Mariel's presence the week before the death, not in a hostile way, she said, but because Mariel had come to her with a concern. Evelyn had long been protective of family reputation. She knew the community, its small mercies and its harsh judgments. Mariel had confided that she intended to raise questions with a professor, to pursue something that might ripple outward and unsettle people. Evelyn's confession was a soft thing and became an explanatory force when layered against the other facts. She had driven Mariel once to consult with someone who could illuminate the sample provenance, not Dr. Voss, she claimed, but another colleague who visited her church. She had met Mariel briefly at dusk on the rental road, and later found Mariel collapsed when she stopped by the house carrying a thermos and a handkerchief. The handkerchief matched the one found near Mariel's notebooks. Evelyn's presence at the scene, her proximity, her domestic knowledge, all placed her within the range of opportunity. But why would Evelyn, a grandmother, go so far? The answer was not simple, and it was not monstrous in caricature. It was a slim, devastating human calculus. Mariel, in private confessions that surfaced in a battered notebook, had hinted that if she pushed the inquiry public it would bring scrutiny on a community partner, a small company that had quietly supported local jobs and to which Evelyn's late husband had once owed a kindness. The company's collapse would ripple in ways that would harm people she loved. Mariel had insisted the truth mattered. Evelyn had feared the damage it would do to the town and to the fragile scaffolding of favors that kept people afloat. The act, when reconstructed from fragments, did not fit the violent caricature the imagination might craft. It fit instead the shape of a sudden, panicked attempt to stop escalation, a confrontation that escalated in ways neither party intended, a misstep at a threshold, a collapse that became a finality no one had planned. The window lock's manipulation made sense now as less a calculated exit than as a hurried attempt to leave without alarming neighbors. The missing photo, taken by Mariel and later removed from evidence, was explained in Evelyn's account as a small attempt to keep a privacy that had been misread as concealment. Her hands in the ledger were those of a neighbor who ran errands. Her fingerprints on a package were ordinary. There was an ache in Caleb's chest as he read Evelyn's steady voice in the interview recording. She did not confess to poison or malice. She confessed to a choice born of protection that became something else. She had not meant the finality that occurred. The result, legal phrasing later called manslaughter in a plea, but in the room where the facts were first assembled, the truth had the texture of quiet catastrophe. The least suspected person had been the one closest to family logic, the person who translated fear into a small, immediate action meant to halt ripple effects. It was the most reasonable explanation in a human register, and the most devastating because it was so avoidable. Confrontation with such outcomes refracts the old question, did justice occur? Into a quieter, more clinical query, could it have been otherwise? The answer is never tidy. Caleb felt the weight of that conclusion like a low, sustained note. The legal machinery moved as it must. Paperwork turned. Statements were filed. Those bound by duty did the work of classification and consequence. But the human geography of the case, the reasons and the small choices lay exposed in the dim. A grandmother's fear, a student's stubbornness, an advisor's ambition, a neighbor's observant memory, a handyman's casual route through town. The twist was not a lightning strike. It was a slow reveal of how ordinary attachments can make ordinary people push in directions that end lives. Caleb closed the file slowly. He thought not of triumph, but of the thin lines that separate protection and harm, of how a life can be altered by a single human decision meant to shelter others. The case had an answer now, but its edges were sharp and unsparing. The courthouse hallway was quiet when the final paperwork passed into the clerk's hands. A single fluorescent light flickered above the doorway, its pulse soft, irregular, almost tired. Caleb Mercer stepped back, letting the sequence of procedure settle. Signatures, stamps, file transfers, all of it orderly, framed by rules that did not bend for grief or subtlety. Mariel Duvall had accepted the plea agreement. No spectacle, no protest. She moved through the process with the worn composure of someone who had spent her life maintaining calm for others. Her posture remained steady, her voice nearly silent. The law treated her as an offender, and yet she carried herself like someone who still believed she was protecting a fragile structure that everyone else had stopped seeing. When she passed Caleb in the hall, she paused not to speak but to acknowledge. A slow nod, one almost tender. He returned the gesture. She continued walking, the low echo of her steps fading into the building's deeper corridors. Then she was gone. Caleb exhaled, long and measured. The case was over. After 30 years of sediment settling over truth, the deeper layers had finally lifted. But closure, he realized again, was not a finish line. It was a condition, temporary, brittle, unevenly distributed. He waited by the window that overlooked the courthouse steps. Outside, a faint breeze traced the edge of the sidewalk, lifting fallen leaves into shallow spirals. The weather was mild, indifferent. People moved along the street with the same pace they always had, unaware of the quiet resolution occurring behind the stone facade. The world did not shift to mark the end of an old case. It simply continued. He held the final report in his hand, the summary that would enter the archives, bound to be read someday by someone seeking precedent or curiosity. The text inside was careful, restrained. It presented the facts plainly. The phrasing was neutral. It did not express the tension of the case, the fear that shaped choices, the chain of mistakes and protective instincts that had woven themselves into a fatal night. It was a document of record, not of feeling. The law had no designated space for the small, complicated reasons that people make irreversible decisions. Caleb stepped outside into the mid-afternoon air. The light had changed since morning. It softened the edges of buildings, made long shadows across the pavement. He walked without aim, letting the weight of 3 decades of unfinished work ease just enough to move forward. His mind returned uninvited to the house, the room where everything had stopped, the dust, the pale light, the faint outline on the floor, the sense that time had been suspended. That place had shaped him. It had stayed with him when other cases slipped away. He thought of Mariel Duvall again. Not the file, not the photographs, but the person described in small side notes. Her calm persistence, her generous habits, the way she recorded details in her ever-present notebook. A young woman who had believed her choices mattered. Someone who had tried to be careful. He imagined her walking the narrow road by the rental house, holding folders of data, unaware that the human machinery around her, the ambitions, the fears, the unspoken loyalties, was about to clash with her intention. Her death had been traced, documented, legally settled. But the reasons remained textured, not linear. Evelyn's confession was not an easy one. It had been shaped by a life's worth of beliefs about duty, reputation, community welfare, all of them intersecting with a moment where fear overrode judgment. The truth, Caleb thought, was rarely a clean revelation. More often it was a mosaic assembled from fragments that resisted placement. People carry contradictions with a quiet persistence. Evelyn had not been malicious, she had been afraid. Mariel had not been reckless, she had been principled. Dr. Voss had not orchestrated deceit, he had slipped into professional comfort that others mistook for conspiracy. Tommy and Liam and Marceline had lived at the periphery, orbiting the same ordinary spaces without ever crossing the decisive point. Yet all their movements converged into the single, unresolved shape of a tragedy. He walked toward the riverfront. The late sun reflected off the slow-moving water, scattering light in sharp, uneven glints. The river had always carried sediment from upstream, minerals, driftwood, fragments of plant life, layering them in quiet patterns no one noticed unless they examined the banks closely. Cases were not much different. Time layered them. People layered them. And beneath all of it, the core often stayed hidden until someone disturbed the settled dust. He took a seat on a low bench near the water. The calm surface did not reflect the currents running beneath it. He watched the slight ripple created by a passing breeze. A few birds skimmed low above the river, their wings angled with controlled precision. His mind drifted to the first time he had walked into the rental house. The young version of himself standing in a doorway, eager and certain. He remembered every detail that had felt significant, the half-full cup on the counter, the notebooks arranged on the desk, the window slightly ajar. He remembered the quiet and how it pressed in on him like a question. But now, with years behind him, he understood the quiet differently. It had not been emptiness. It had been presence, the kind that clings to unsaid things, waiting for the moment someone finally hears them. He folded the report gently and slid it into his jacket. For a long moment, he watched the river without speaking. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a breath. "Mariel, I hope this brings you peace." There was no response, no shift of wind, no signal from the world acknowledging his words. Justice rarely echoed back. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His reflection on the water broke into fragments, assembled again, then broke once more as the current passed. It reminded him of the contact sheet, the small square frames that held a story incomplete but pointing toward a truth that refused disappearance. He thought of Evelyn's final expression, not defiant, not apologetic, something more complex, something shaped by years of carrying a decision she could neither undo nor justify fully. A face that belonged not to evil but to the burden of unintended consequence. Truth, he reflected, was not moral clarity. It was alignment of evidence, of context, of human behavior. And even when aligned, it did not cleanse what had happened. It simply revealed it. He rose slowly from the bench. His joints protested faintly, a reminder of the time that had passed since 1992. The day was quiet. The town moved on, indifferent to the fact that a case older than many of its residents had finally resolved. As he walked back toward the precinct, he noticed how ordinary everything looked. The hardware store, the bakery, the crossing signal blinking at its steady interval. Behind those simple facades lived the same layered tensions that had shaped the case: quiet allegiances, old debts, unspoken fears, people trying to preserve stability in whatever ways they understood. That was the truth, not the legal answer, not the signed forms. The truth lay in the subtle forces beneath the surface, the ones invisible until they collided with someone like Mariel, someone who inadvertently triggered long-standing anxieties. Caleb paused at the corner nearest the precinct. The sky had shifted to early evening, the light dimming into a muted gold. For a moment, Everything felt still, the same stillness he had sensed in the crime scene decades earlier, when the air seemed to hold its breath. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to the soft ambient sounds around him, cars in the distance, footsteps on the sidewalk, a faint rustle of paper from a passing courier. These details grounded him. This case had changed him. It had reminded him that justice was not a triumph but a task, a methodical, procedural movement toward clarity. And beneath that movement lived something more fragile, an acknowledgement that truth could be found, but it could not always heal. He opened his eyes and continued walking. The precinct doors came into view, familiar and worn. As he reached for the handle, he caught his own reflection in the glass, older, quieter, carrying the subtle fatigue of someone who had spent his life listening to stories that rarely ended cleanly. He thought of Mariel once more, her notebooks, her diligence, the conversations she never got to finish. He thought of Evelyn and the cost of choices made in fear. He thought of all the minor clues that had waited decades to align. The truth was visible now, but only because he had looked past the surface, only because he had allowed the quiet details to speak. He entered the building. A new case file lay on his desk, thin and unassuming. He stared at it for a moment, then placed his hand lightly on the cover. The day continued. The work continued. And somewhere in the background of his mind, the river kept moving, carrying its fragments of sediment, revealing only what rose to the surface, concealing everything else beneath shifting layers. Some truths are like that, he thought. Visible only when the current is right.